The day I buried my mother was the day my husband decided to bury our marriage. He stood there, in my childhood home, surrounded by grieving family, and chose that exact moment to tell me he was leaving. He thought I was at my absolute weakest. He had no idea his decision of leaving me at my mother's funeral would be the biggest mistake of his entire life. This story is not about how I crumbled. It's about how I learned to fight back from the ashes. The sheer cruelty of my husband leaving me at my mother's funeral wasn't an ending. It was an ignition. He thought he was walking away with my inheritance and his freedom. But he was the only person in the room who didn't know I had already changed all the rules. If you want to see exactly what was in the box I handed him that made him start screaming, and how I handled the aftermath of my husband leaving me at my mother's funeral, you're in the right place. This isn't just a story. It's a masterclass in justice. Hit subscribe, because you need to see how this ends. So, let me take you back to that day. The scent of lilies still haunts me. It was thick, cloying, a sweet smell of death that filled every corner of my mother's house. I'm Eleanor, and I was 51 at the time. The house was crowded with faces I'd known my whole life, their expressions a soft, blurry mix of pity and sorrow. They moved in hushed tones, balancing small plates of catered sandwiches and sipping tea from my mother's china. I felt like a ghost in my own life, drifting between conversations, accepting condolences that felt like they were meant for someone else. My grief was a heavy cloak, but under it, there was just a profound emptiness. My mother was gone. The center of my world had vanished. I was standing by the fireplace, tracing the rim of an untouched teacup, when Richard, my husband, touched my arm. His touch wasn't comforting. It was functional. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but devoid of warmth. "Can I talk to you in the kitchen for a second?" I nodded, following him through the small hallway. The kitchen was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was cold, sterile, the stainless steel appliances gleaming under the fluorescent lights, while the living room was filled with the heat of shared grief. The kitchen felt like a morgue. I leaned back against the cool marble of the countertop, the chill seeping through the fabric of my black dress. He didn't ease into it. He didn't offer a single word of comfort about the day, about my mother. He just stood there, by the sink, looking not at me, but at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. "Look, Eleanor," he began, his voice flat, businesslike. "I know today is difficult, but there's no good time for this, so I might as well just say it." He took a shallow breath. "Now that your mother is gone, there's nothing really keeping me here. I'm leaving." The words didn't register at first. They were just sounds, meaningless vibrations in the cold air. Leaving to go where the grocery store. He must have seen the confusion on my face, because he clarified, with a hint of impatience. "I'm leaving you, Eleanor. I've met someone. Her name is Chloe, and I want to start actually living my life." And that's when it happened. The ice. The profound, shocking pain I expected, the shattering of my heart, the hot sting of tears that never came. Instead, a wave of absolute, freezing calm washed over me. The muffled sounds of mourning from the living room faded into a dull hum. The scent of the lilies vanished. My entire universe, which had been foggy with grief, suddenly snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. And the only thing I could see clearly was the man standing in front of me. A stranger. A cruel, pathetic stranger who had waited until the single most vulnerable day of my life to deliver his killing blow. He mistook my silence for weakness. I could see the relief in his eyes. He thought I was broken, that I would collapse into a sobbing heap he could simply step over on his way out the door. He had no idea that in that moment, he hadn't broken me. He had armed me. I didn't say a word. I just pushed myself off the counter, my movements steady and deliberate. I looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time, he flinched, as if seeing something in me he'd never seen before. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was nothing. A complete and total absence of the love I once had for him. And I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him standing alone in the cold, sterile silence. He thought this was his grand exit, the start of his new life. He had no idea it was the beginning of his end. As I stood there in the living room, the meaningless symphony of condolences buzzing around me, my body was present, but my mind was already gone. It had traveled back 3 years, to the beginning of the end, long before the scent of funeral lilies filled the air. It started not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping decay, the way illness often does. My mother, Margaret, had always been a force of nature, a whirlwind of wit, laughter, and fiercely independent spirit. But dementia is a thief. It stole her, piece by piece, right in front of my eyes. First, it was the small things, forgotten keys, repeated stories. Then it was bigger things, like getting lost on her way home from the market she'd shopped at for 40 years. The day I found her trying to make tea by putting the kettle in the microwave, I knew she couldn't live alone anymore. Bringing her into our home felt like the only natural thing to do. She was my mother. You take care of your own. The first year was a blur of adjustments. I learned the new rhythms of her life, the good days, when she'd tell me stories of her childhood with perfect clarity, and the bad days, when she'd look at me with vacant eyes and ask where her daughter, Eleanor, was. Richard was supportive, in the way a person is supportive of a project they approve of but have no intention of working on. He'd pat my arm and say, "You're a saint, honey," before disappearing into his home office for the rest of the night. The financial strain came next. Her needs grew more complex, and so did the bills, special foods, medications that insurance only partially covered, a daytime caregiver I hired so I could have a few hours to myself. Richard's sighs grew louder. His comments, always disguised as practical concern, started to feel like tiny, sharp digs. Another prescription he'd ask, looking at a receipt. It's just staggering. "Eleanor, we have to be realistic about this." His version of realistic always seemed to involve a brochure for a state-funded nursing home that smelled of bleach and despair. I refused. This was my mother. One night, about a year before she passed, I was sitting by her bed, reading a book aloud. She'd been mostly nonverbal for weeks, lost in the fog. I thought she was asleep. Suddenly, her hand, surprisingly strong, gripped my wrist. I looked up from my book, startled. Her eyes, which had been cloudy and distant, were crystal clear. It was her. My mother was there. "Eleanor, listen to me," she whispered, her voice raspy but firm. Her gaze was intense, urgent. "Your husband, Richard." She paused, as if gathering her strength. "He knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Be careful." Just as quickly as it came, the light in her eyes faded, her grip slackened, and she drifted away again, leaving me with her words hanging in the silent room. The price of everything, the value of nothing. It sent a chill down my spine I couldn't explain. The warning felt too specific, too real. But then I dismissed it. It was the disease talking, I told myself. A moment of scrambled thoughts. But the words stuck with me, a splinter in my mind. The arguments about money became more frequent. Richard started pushing for us to sell my mother's house, which she had put in my name years ago. It's just sitting there. Eleanor, he'd argue. Think of what that money could do for us, for her care. The thought felt like a betrayal. That house was my childhood. It was the last piece of her that was still whole. His pressure was what finally pushed me to do it. I decided I needed to get a perfect, airtight grip on our finances. I needed to prove to him that we could manage without selling her legacy. I bought a comprehensive financial management software for our home computer. It was supposed to track every penny, every account, every investment. My plan was to create a budget so detailed, so undeniable, that he'd have to drop the subject of selling the house. I installed it one Tuesday afternoon while he was at the office, feeling like a responsible, proactive wife. I had no idea I was actually setting a trap. For the first few months, it was just numbers. I made spreadsheets. I tracked our spending. And then I started seeing oddities. Little blips that didn't make sense. A recurring charge for two at a fancy Italian restaurant across town I'd never heard of. Weekly cash withdrawals from an ATM near a boutique hotel. Always on a Thursday afternoon. His expense reports for his business trips didn't line up. There were hotel bills from cities he was never supposed to be in. My heart began to pound every time I opened the program. A cold dread started to pool in my stomach. This wasn't just messy accounting. This was a secret. The software had a feature I hadn't planned on using, a keylogger, for security purposes. I told myself not to. It was a violation of privacy. But my mother's words echoed in my head. Be careful. One night, when he was supposedly away at a conference in Chicago, I opened the log, and there it was. My world split open. It wasn't just an affair. It was a whole other life. Emails to a woman named Chloe, filled with words and promises he hadn't given me in a decade. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the financial planning. I saw spreadsheets of their own, projections, budgets, and they were all based on a single, monstrous eventuality. They were talking about our money, my mother's house, my inheritance. It was all laid out. Their future funded by my mother's death. I had to put my head between my knees to keep from passing out. The screen blurred through my tears. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was waiting for my mother to die. The man sleeping next to me at night, the man who called me a saint for taking care of my own mother, was actively planning a future built upon her grave. The grief for my marriage died in that instant. It was a swift, clean death, cauterized by a rage so pure it felt holy. This wasn't about a broken heart anymore. This was about a legacy. My mother had spent her life building a small but secure world for us, and this vulture, this parasite, was not going to pick it apart. Her warning hadn't been a symptom of her disease. It had been a prophecy, and I, her daughter, was going to make damn sure I fulfilled my end of it. He wanted to know the price of everything fine. I was about to teach him the cost of betrayal. After that discovery, the world tilted on its axis. The first instinct was primal, a burning need to scream, to shatter the quiet hypocrisy of our home, to throw his laptop against the wall and watch his secret life splinter into a million pieces. I wanted to confront him, to see the shock and fear on his face as his carefully constructed world crumbled. But then I heard a small, frail cough from my mother's bedroom down the hall. And just like that, the inferno of my rage cooled, focused, and sharpened into a single, lethal point. Not now, I thought. She needs me. My war would have to be a silent one. Living a double life is the most exhausting thing I've ever done. The next morning, when Richard came home from his conference, he walked in smelling of hotel soap and perfume that wasn't mine. He smiled, kissed my cheek, and the effort it took not to recoil, not to physically scrub his touch from my skin, was monumental. I became an actress. I asked about his flight, about his meetings, all while my mind replayed the words I'd read on the screen. Once the old woman passes, we'll finally be free. I'd smile at him over dinner, listening to him complain about work, my heart a block of ice in my chest. He'd talk about our future, about retirement plans, and I would nod along, a silent partner to a fiction he thought we were still writing together. He was so confident in my ignorance, so wrapped up in his own deceit, that he couldn't see the woman sitting across from him was already gone. He was talking to a ghost. As the months wore on, my mother's health declined rapidly. The dementia tightened its grip, and the good days became rarer, then disappeared altogether. My life shrank to the four walls of her room. I quit my part-time job at the local library, my one small connection to a world outside of sickness and secrets. My days became an endless cycle of changing bed linens, spoon-feeding her meals she barely touched, and holding her hand through sundown terrors where she'd cry out for people who had been gone for 50 years. The physical toll was immense. My back ached constantly. There were dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide, but the emotional toll was worse. I was watching the most vibrant person I'd ever known fade away, and I had to do it alone, in a house filled with the deafening silence of my husband's betrayal. Richard's performance as the concerned son-in-law had ended. He saw my exhaustion not as a product of my love and sacrifice, but as a personal inconvenience. He stopped asking how Mom was doing. He started spending more nights working late. One evening, I was struggling to help my mother from her bed to the bathroom. My arms were shaking with fatigue, and I called out to him for help. He appeared in the doorway, not moving to assist, just watching with an expression of pure disdain. He looked at my stained sweater, my messy hair, and said, his voice dripping with condescension, "You know, Eleanor, you're letting this whole situation consume you. You've really let yourself go." In that moment, I didn't feel hurt. I felt a profound sense of pity for him. He was so small, so utterly blind to anything that wasn't a reflection of his own selfish needs. I just looked at him, my arms still supporting the frail weight of my mother, and said nothing. My silence was a wall he couldn't penetrate. He just shook his head and walked away, leaving me to struggle alone. That was the night I decided to make the call. The next afternoon, the daytime caregiver arrived, giving me a precious 2-hour window. I didn't go for a walk. I didn't run errands. I went into the garage, sat in the driver's seat of my cold car, and pulled out a small piece of paper from my pocket. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady when I dialed. "Mr. Davies, please. It's Eleanor Caldwell." Arthur Davies had been my father's estate lawyer and a friend of the family for decades. His voice was warm, familiar. "Eleanor, how are you? My dear, how's Margaret?" "That's why I'm calling," I said, getting straight to the point. I told him everything. I laid it all out, the affair, the secret accounts, Richard's talk of selling the house, the emails about my mother's inheritance. I spoke in a low, even tone, recounting the monstrous details as if I were reading a grocery list. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Arthur spoke, his voice no longer warm, but cold and hard as steel. "That contemptible son of a bitch," he said softly. "Okay, Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. Do not confront him. Do not let him know that you know anything. You will continue to play the part of the devoted, grieving daughter and the oblivious wife. And while you do that, you are going to gather every single piece of evidence. We're not just going to build a case against him. We're going to build a fortress." And so my secret mission began. It became my ritual. Every night, after I'd gotten Mom settled and Richard was snoring in our bed, I would creep downstairs to the home office. The house would be completely silent except for the quiet hum of the computer and the soft whir of the printer. Under the dim glow of the monitor, I printed everything. Every email he'd sent to Chloe, every secret credit card statement detailing their dinners, their hotel stays, their jewelry purchases. I printed the travel itineraries for trips he told me were for business. I printed the spreadsheets where they had audaciously mapped out their future using my family's money. Each page that slid out of the printer felt like a brick being laid. I bought a small, fireproof lockbox. I kept it hidden in the back of my mother's closet, tucked away under a stack of old quilts that still smelled faintly of her perfume. That closet became my war room. The box was my arsenal. Night after night, I added to it. The evidence piled up, a monument to his lies. And as the box grew heavier, I felt lighter. The pain was always there, of course. A constant, dull ache behind my ribs. But it was changing. It was no longer the debilitating pain of a victim. It was becoming something else fuel. Every email I printed was a betrayal. Every receipt was a lie. But they were more than that now. They were promises. A promise to my mother that I would protect her memory from his greed, and a promise to myself that my story would not end with me on my knees. I was no longer just a wife caring for her dying mother. I was a guardian, standing watch over a legacy he was trying to plunder. The last few weeks of my mother's life were quiet. The fighting part of her illness was over. She just faded. I spent most of my days and nights in a chair by her bed, holding her hand, reading to her, even though I knew she couldn't hear me. There was a strange, sad peace in those final moments. I knew a terrible storm was coming, the one I had been meticulously planning for. Richard was oblivious, floating through the house with an air of barely concealed anticipation. He thought he was waiting for her to die so his new life could finally begin. He had no idea we were all just waiting for him to run out of time. I walked out of that kitchen, leaving Richard standing alone in the cold, sterile silence. Re-entering the living room was like surfacing from underwater. The air was warm, thick with the scent of lilies and coffee. The low, respectful murmur of conversation washed over me, and for a moment, the world felt normal again, if devastatingly sad. My body was on autopilot, nodding at a cousin, accepting a squeezed shoulder from an old neighbor. But my mind was a world away, a silent, ticking clock counting down the final seconds of my old life. Richard emerged a minute later. I learned later, during one of the depositions, what he was thinking in that moment. He wasn't thinking about me or my mother or the 25 years we had shared. He was thinking about how easy it had been. He felt a profound sense of relief. He said, the hardest part was over. He had expected tears, screaming, a scene. My silence, my calm retreat, wasn't a sign of strength to him. It was a sign of defeat. He saw a broken woman, and it made him feel powerful. He thought he had finally, truly, gotten away with it all. He scanned the room, his eyes gliding over the grieving faces until they found what they were looking for. Chloe. She was sitting on the love seat by the window, talking to the Hamiltons, a couple we used to play bridge with. She was good. I'll give her that. Her expression was one of perfect, somber sympathy. She was wearing a simple, elegant black dress, but it was just a little too fashionable, a little too well-fitted for a funeral. It was a dress for an event, not a mourning. She looked up, as if sensing his gaze, and their eyes met across the crowded room. It was a tiny exchange, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. A slight lift of his chin, a confident little puff of his chest. Her lips curved into the faintest, quickest of smiles before she turned back to Mrs. Hamilton, her face a mask of compassion once more. It was a look of shared victory, a silent confirmation between two conspirators who believed they had just pulled off the perfect crime. He was the smartest man in the room, and she was his beautiful prize. While he was basking in the glow of his own arrogance, I was moving. Every step I took was deliberate. I walked to the fireplace, past the clusters of relatives, and stood before the large, framed photograph of my mother on the mantel. It was her favorite picture, taken in her garden a few summers ago. She was laughing, her face tilted towards the sun, her eyes crinkling at the corners. I reached out and gently brushed a speck of dust from the glass. A real, genuine smile touched my lips. This is for you, Mom, I thought. I'm going to protect what you built. My Aunt Carol came up beside me then, wrapping me in a hug that smelled of lavender and hairspray. Oh, Eleanor, she whispered into my hair. You are being so incredibly strong through all of this. Your mother would be so proud. I know she would be, I said, and the words held a double meaning that only I understood. The irony was so thick I could taste it. She had no idea how strong I was about to be. I gave her shoulder a squeeze and moved towards the small mahogany table where we'd placed the guest book. But I wasn't interested in the book. Beside it sat a small, polished wooden box. It was my mother's jewelry box, the one she'd kept on her dresser since I was a little girl. It was a simple thing, but it was one of her most treasured possessions. Earlier that morning, before anyone had arrived, I had taken out her jewelry and replaced it with something else. I rested my hand on the cool, smooth lid for just a moment. My weapon, my fortress. The energy in the room was beginning to shift. People were finishing their coffee, glancing at their watches. The polite, obligatory period of mourning was drawing to a close. It was time. My gaze drifted back to Richard. He was now standing near Chloe, laughing quietly at something Mr. Hamilton said. He put a hand on Chloe's back, a casual, proprietary gesture. He was so comfortable, so happy, here in my mother's house, surrounded by the evidence of her life and the pain of her absence. That was the final push I needed. The sight of his casual joy in the face of my profound loss was the spark that lit the fuse. I walked over to the drink table. With a hand that was perfectly steady, I picked up one of my mother's crystal water glasses and the small silver spoon that sat beside the sugar bowl. I took a deep breath, the cold, still air filling my lungs. I walked to the very center of the room. Richard looked up from his conversation, a flicker of annoyance on his face, as if I were about to interrupt his good time. I raised the glass. The spoon touched the crystal, and a single, clear, piercing note rang out, cutting through the quiet hum of conversation. The room fell silent. Every head turned. 50 pairs of eyes, all focused on me. I saw Richard's expression shift from annoyance to confusion. I met his gaze from across the room, and I smiled. My smile felt foreign on my face, a tight, unfamiliar stretching of muscles I hadn't used in months. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy blanket of anticipation. I could feel every single person holding their breath. I let the silence hang there for a moment longer, a conductor waiting for the perfect moment to begin the symphony. Then I spoke, my voice not loud, but clear and steady, easily filling the quiet space. "Thank you all so much for being here," I began, my gaze sweeping across the room, acknowledging the familiar, sympathetic faces of friends and family. "It means the world to me and to my brother, David, that you're here to honor our mother. She loved so many of you." I paused, letting my eyes drift to the photograph on the mantel. My mother believed in truth above all else. She hated secrets. She used to say that secrets were a type of poison that rotted a family from the inside out. In her final weeks, she made a request of me. She asked me to ensure her legacy was protected and that her final wishes were carried out with the same integrity she lived her life with. "And that," I said, turning my gaze fully onto Richard, "is what I intend to do right now." His confused expression was beginning to curdle into annoyance. He clearly thought this was some overly emotional display, and it was delaying his exit. "Richard," I said, and his name was a cold, hard stone in my mouth. "As her husband of 25 years, you knew my mother better than most. You know she saved special things, things that held meaning. She left something specifically for you." The mood in the room shifted. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was unexpected. This was theater. I walked over to the mahogany table, my heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. I picked up the polished wooden box, its weight familiar and comforting in my hands. I walked it over to him. He stood frozen, a deer in the headlights as I approached. Chloe, I noticed, was watching with a hungry, curious glint in her eyes, probably imagining a Rolex or a set of antique cufflinks. "Go on," I urged, holding the box out to him. "It's for you." He took it, his movements stiff and uncertain. He looked at me, then at the box. For a second, I think he was actually flattered. He fumbled with the small brass latch, his fingers seeming thick and clumsy. He lifted the lid. I watched his face. I will never, for the rest of my life, forget the sequence of expressions that flickered across it. First, confusion, as his eyes registered not velvet lining and jewelry, but a neat stack of white paper. Then, dawning horror. On the very top of the stack was a copy of a bank statement from my mother's personal savings account. A large, angry red circle was drawn around a transfer request for $50,000, made just 3 days before she died. The transfer, to an account I now knew belonged to him, had been denied by the bank. My mother's first wish, I announced, my voice ringing with an authority I didn't know I possessed, was to ensure her life savings went to the people she intended, her grandchildren, not to those who tried to access her accounts while she was on her deathbed. A collective, sharp gasp sucked the air out of the room. Richard's head snapped up, his face ashen, his eyes wide with pure panic. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice suddenly high-pitched. "Eleanor, what is this nonsense? Keep looking," I said softly. His hands were shaking now. He shuffled the bank statement aside, and underneath it were the photographs. Not old family pictures. These were glossy, 8x10 prints. The top one was a shot of him and Chloe, laughing on a sun-drenched terrace, a bottle of expensive wine on the table between them. In the background, the rolling hills of Tuscany were unmistakable. Her second wish, I continued, my voice as cold and sharp as ice, was for her family to be free of lies. She always said the truth has a way of coming out, didn't she? "Richard, those are from your business trip to Florence last September. The one I later discovered was paid for with $5,000 from our joint savings account." Every single person in the room turned to look at Chloe. Her face, which had been a mask of polite sympathy, had crumbled into a mosaic of shock and terror. She looked like a cornered animal, frantically searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is a setup," Richard finally yelled, finding his voice. "She's lost her mind with grief. She's manipulating all of you. These are fake. I'm afraid they're quite real. Richard." The new voice was calm, professional, and cut through Richard's frantic denials like a surgeon's scalpel. From the back of the room, Mr. Arthur Davies, my lawyer, stepped forward. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and an expression of grim disappointment. He looked every bit the seasoned, unimpeachable professional he was. As the executor of Margaret's estate, and as Mrs. Caldwell's legal counsel, he said, his voice carrying easily, "I can confirm the validity of those bank records. I can also confirm that I have a dozen more photographs, time-stamped, from the private investigator Mrs. Caldwell hired." He stopped directly in front of Richard, who looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "Mr. Davies wasn't finished, and I can also confirm that, as of this morning, a judge has signed an emergency court order. All of your joint assets have been frozen, pending a full investigation into financial malfeasance and fraud. The funds from your mother-in-law's estate, including her home, are secured in an irrevocable trust. You will not see a single dime of it." That was the final blow. The papers slipped from Richard's nerveless fingers, scattering across the floor around his feet like dead leaves. The blood drained from his face, only to be replaced by a blotchy, purple tide of pure rage. For a moment, he was speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Then, he found his voice, and he screamed. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure, impotent fury. "You," he shrieked, his eyes locking on me, filled with a hatred so profound it was almost breathtaking. "You planned this! You planned this whole thing! You conniving bitch!" He lunged, a mindless, reflexive movement of rage. The scream ripped through the room, but his lunge was cut short. Before he could take a second step, my brother David was there, a solid wall of fury between us. My cousins Mark and Stephen flanked him instantly, their faces grim. Richard, for all his bluster, was a coward. He stopped dead, sputtering. "You can't do this." he snarled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "This is my house too." "Not anymore," David said, his voice dangerously low. He didn't need to shout. The authority was absolute. He and Mark each took one of Richard's arms. The fight went out of him then, replaced by a pathetic, sputtering rage. They marched him towards the door, his final words a hollow threat thrown over his shoulder. "You'll regret this, Eleanor. You'll be nothing without me." The front door slammed shut, and the silence that followed was deafening. In that quiet, I saw a flicker of movement near the kitchen. It was Chloe. While all eyes had been on Richard's dramatic exit, she had simply vanished. No goodbye, no final glance, just a quiet, self-serving retreat. The ship was sinking, and she had found her lifeboat. The air in the room had changed. The heavy grief was gone, replaced by a stunned, electric respect. My Aunt Carol rushed to hug me, not with pity, but with a fierce pride. Friends of my mother's came up, their eyes saying what words couldn't. They saw a woman they thought they knew become someone else entirely. David came back to my side, his jaw still tight. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am now," I said, and the truth of those words settled deep in my bones. Mr. Davies, my lawyer, approached, his expression all business. He didn't coddle me. He addressed me as an equal. "What are your instructions?" "Eleanor." The question solidified the new reality. I was in charge. My voice was clear and steady when I answered. "David, go with him. Make sure he only packs his personal items and get the keys. Change the locks first thing tomorrow." I then turned to Mr. Davies. "File for a restraining order immediately. I want him kept away from me and this house, and start the divorce proceedings. Cite infidelity and financial fraud. I want this over." There was no hesitation. This was the voice of a woman who had finally taken back control of her life. Later, after most of the guests had departed in a quiet stream, leaving just the closest of my family, I saw one of the glossy photos from the box lying face up on the floor. It was Richard and Chloe, smiling under the Tuscan sun. I bent down, picked it up, and looked at their happy, treacherous faces. I felt nothing. No pain, no anger, just a profound, quiet emptiness where my love for him used to be. I walked to the fireplace, where the embers still glowed warmly, and dropped the picture into them. I watched the edges curl and blacken, their perfect vacation turning to ash. It was a messy, brutal surgery, but the poison was finally out. My house and my life could finally begin to heal. It's funny how time works. The days immediately following the funeral felt like wading through mud, each moment slow, heavy, and exhausting. The legal proceedings, the endless phone calls, the quiet, empty nights. But then you look up, and 6 months have passed. The world has tilted back on its axis, and the sun is shining again. The divorce was as swift and brutal as Richard deserved. Mr. Davies was a shark, and Richard was bleeding in the water. In the end, the evidence was so overwhelming that he had no choice but to surrender. He left the marriage with his personal belongings, a mountain of debt from his secret life, and the public humiliation he had so carefully designed for me. I heard through the grapevine that Chloe had disappeared the moment she realized the money was gone. Last I heard, Richard had to sell his car and move back into his parents' basement in Ohio, a fitting end for a man who thought he was a king. But this story isn't really about him anymore. It's about what grows in the space people leave behind. My mother's house, once a place of sickness and secrets, is now filled with light. I had the dark, heavy curtains taken down, painted the walls a warm, creamy white, and filled every room with plants. It's a happy house now. It's my house, and in it, I've built my new life. With the inheritance my mother left me, the legacy I fought to protect. I started the Margaret's Garden Foundation. It's a small charity, but it has a vital mission. We provide grants and resources to people who are full-time caregivers for their ailing family members. We help the helpers, the silent saints who are doing the exhausting, thankless work of caring for the ones they love. I turned my pain into purpose. My mother's memory isn't a source of sadness anymore. It's a garden that helps others grow. Just last week, a young woman named Sarah came to my office. She was applying for a grant to help care for her father, who has MS. She was tired, her eyes holding the same weary shadow I remembered seeing in my own mirror. We talked for a while, and she confessed that she was in a toxic relationship with a man who made her feel small for the sacrifices she was making. "I just feel so weak," she said, her voice cracking. "He makes me feel like I've lost myself." I looked at this young woman, at her strength she couldn't yet see in herself, and I knew exactly what to say. "You're not weak," I told her, my voice gentle but firm. "You're a warrior. And that man, men like him, they don't actually take anything from you. They just reveal the strength you had inside you all along. He's not your story, Sarah. He's just the chapter that teaches you how to write your own ending." Watching the hope flicker back into her eyes was more satisfying than any revenge. It was healing. Richard's betrayal wasn't the end of my story. It was the fire that burned away a life that was too small for me, clearing the ground for something new and beautiful to grow. And that's the truth of it. This was never just a story about a husband leaving his wife at her mother's funeral. It's the story of anyone who has ever been betrayed, underestimated, or left feeling like their world was over. It's a story about finding out that you are the one holding the matches, the blueprints, and the seeds. That's why this channel exists. We are a community of survivors, of builders, of gardeners who know that the most beautiful flowers often grow in the soil of our deepest wounds. When you subscribe, you're not just getting another story. You are joining a circle of people who refuse to be defined by their darkest days. So if my story touched you, if it made you feel seen, hit that like button so I know it reached you. In the comments below, I want you to tell me about a time you found a strength you didn't know you had. Your story could be the light someone else needs to see today. And most importantly, if you believe in the power of a comeback, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Let's keep reminding the world and each other that sometimes the most beautiful gardens can only grow from the ashes